Do you remember when you first played The Witcher 3 on your old PC, and even the poor FPS didn't prevent you from enjoying this open world? Every mission and side quest was still exciting even after 50 hours, as they were unique and the game always tried to give us a new story. But what the happened to new games? Somehow, completely unnoticed, the industry changed the design code of AAA open world games and started focusing us to play not for fun, but just to close all the markers with similar tasks on the map. But how could we have allowed this to happen? Why don't developers care about their games anymore, like they did 10 years ago? Why have games stopped giving us something to stay for? And most importantly, what will happen to the gaming industry in the future? Today, I want to talk about why modern games take up so much of our time and how to fix that. Let's remember the old games. No, not these ones, but the really old ones. The ones that people born during the Black Death played on small TVs. One very strange thing becomes apparent. They were simple, but not primitive. Yes, you only had to press 2 to 3 buttons, you had a minimum of systems, but you still sat in front of the screen for hours without even understanding why. Now, spending $70, which by the way was enough to buy 12 megabytes of RAM, we enter another new open world game and get hundreds of character upgrades, 3 menus with his talents, a separate menu with sub-talents, and another menu to explain his previous 2. But despite all this depth, after just 2 hours, you start to catch yourself thinking that the game seems much bigger and more complex than this one, but for some reason much dumber? This is noticeable in almost every major game of recent years. Developers add so many systems that they themselves lose control of why they exist in the first place. Games have started to work on a buffet principle. Take what you want, but none of it will be memorable, and most of it is shit. And what's important here is that this way of designing games didn't just appear out of nowhere. No, long before it became normal for single-player games, this logic was already familiar in genres where playtime, routines, and long-term engagement mattered more than finishing the game at all. Developers seem to be stuck in a mode of reusing mechanics and gameplay. In Starfield, which has been in development for 40 years by the way, you fly between hundreds of planets, but most of them are just copies of the previous one with a different color of sand. In Elden Ring, there are dungeons scattered around which seem cool for like the first 10 hours, but then you see the same room with the same boss, just in a different order. And in Ubisoft projects, the cycle is as stable as a Swiss watch. Go in there, clear it out, set the camp on fire, watch the cutscenes that look like they're from a mobile game, climb the tower, look at the map, find 10 more of the exact same. And this is very strange because technology has become much more powerful, development teams have become much larger, and in general, the resources for modern studios are almost limitless. But it seems that they have put all their energy and creativity into the first few hours of the game to hook you, give you hope, and you don't have time to ask for a refund. And after that, you spend your time on repetitive missions and endless grinding, which takes up more and more of your time without giving you anything in return, and the feeling that you're moving somewhere disappears. And this is where it's worth stopping and just asking one simple question. This whole logic, checklists, timers, stretched content, the illusion of progress didn't just appear out of nowhere. It wasn't invented by Ubisoft or Bethesda overnight. This way of thinking didn't originate in story-driven games at all. It came from a place where player time first became the main metric, from a genre where games were never meant to be finished. Now, those viewers that are watching this video with their jaws hanging in their glasses, remember how in World of Warcraft there were players who just stood on the map, silent, not distracted by anything, repeating the same action for hours? Previously, this was attributed to bots, but then it turned out that there were real players who were simply earning money in the game in order to boost other people's accounts. The industry has always had one interesting side effect to the complexity of games, and MMOs made it impossible to ignore. As soon as progress became tied to massive time investments, long routines, and repetitive tasks, people immediately appeared who were willing to take on the most boring or exhausting parts of the gameplay. In old MMORPGs, this looked completely normal. One person farmed gold, another leveled up a character, and a third led groups through content that most people absolutely hated. This existed even when the phrase gaming industry sounded almost ridiculous. World of Warcraft didn't just popularize this model, it normalized it. Daily quests, weekly lockouts, reputation grinds, raid schedules, optimal farming routes, the game quietly trained players to think in checklists, timers, and efficiency. Not because it was fun, but because falling behind felt worse. And this wasn't an accident. MMOs didn't become like this by mistake. They were the first games designed around retention, not around story, not around an ending, but around making sure you came back tomorrow. None of it exists because it's fun, it exists to build habit, to create fear of falling behind. World of Warcraft didn't just popularize this model, it trained an entire generation of players to accept it as normal. And this is where things get a little uncomfortable. That MMO logic didn't just stay in MMOs. Over time, it leaked into AAA design. The same retention loops, the same time gates, the same feeling that the game isn't meant to be finished, only maintained. Over time, this evolved from a rare practice into an entire parallel market that operated through forums, private deals, and extremely questionable account exchanges. The demand was always there. It's just that games became more massive, more routine, and more time consuming, and someone had to do the part that others didn't want to do. Sooner or later, a place had to appear that would take away the chaos, risks, and human factor. Once a game starts functioning like a system of obligations, a market inevitably appears to offload those obligations onto someone else. This isn't about cheating or breaking games, it's about time. In systems where progress is directly tied to hours invested, time becomes a currency, and any currency creates infrastructure around it. That's why services like Overgear aren't an anomaly. They're actually a logical outcome of games that increasingly expect players to behave like workers. This cannot be called a new trend, but rather a normal infrastructure that has existed for decades. Transparent deals, verified performers, account protection, and the ability not only to get help, but also to earn money if you play well. And if you look at the scale now, it becomes clear why this industry is not disappearing. Games continue to grow in size, requirements, and the amount of time they demand from the player. You and me. And when a title starts to behave like a job, it's natural that there will be people who are ready to do part of that job at a professional level. Oh, by the way, Overgear works not only in MMORPGs, but also in competitive games. For example, our friend who plays like shit in CS2 was able to get from level 2 to level 7 on Faceit, even though he still plays like shit. I'll leave a link to Overgear in the description down below. If you want to save time, skip the boring parts of the game, or conversely earn money with your skills, go check it out. Games waste our time, and I don't mean that they are not worth our time. I actually have dedicated an entire channel to them, as you can see. But let's be honest, gamers rarely make it to the end credits these days, especially if the game takes more than 30 hours to complete. Personally, I bought Ghost of Yotai on the day it was released, and I still haven't finished it yet. First of all, yes, people are lazy. Sometimes I'm lazy. Most people don't finish anything in life. But there's another reason, and it's much deeper. Modern games simply don't respect our time. They waste every second we give them. And even more interestingly, it's not just the developers' fault, although blaming them is the easiest option today. And honestly, I've done it a couple times myself. I will never forget the moment I first stepped out onto the snow-covered streets of Empire Bay in Mafia 2. The neon lights, the old cars with retro music, and the feeling that you've entered a living, breathing world. Or when I first left the shelter in Fallout New Vegas as a child and saw an empty but somehow incredibly attractive desert in front of me. These moments shaped why I fell in love with games and why I now make videos. Because when an open world is done right, it adds something truly magical to the game. Atmosphere, depth, immersion. That's why over the last decade, countless series have switched to the open world format, trying to recreate those same feelings and get more sales. But, you know, I don't believe that most players create open worlds because it makes games better. In most cases, it's the opposite. They make them significantly worse. Structured, well thought out missions with a clear narrative are replaced by empty side quests and fetch quests that exist solely to keep you busy. Take Elden Ring, for example, one of the best games of the decade that everyone has been talking about. I know many people who love Elden Ring. But when they reached the snowy mountains in the north and saw that there was essentially a whole second game ahead of them, they simply gave up. Not because they didn't like the game, but because it didn't live up to its size. The narrative loses momentum when everything takes too long. The stakes don't rise enough, so long stretches of the game start to feel slow and less interesting. While playing Elden Ring, I always had mixed feelings, excitement from new discoveries and irritation from repetitive areas and enemies. Why was half of my time in one of my favorite games spent this way? Because this obsession with making games, I guess, longer, quote unquote, leads to them simply forcing us to spend extra hours. But I'm sure Elden Ring would be much better if there was 20 to 40% less content and everything that remained was unique and dense in meaning. This is exactly how the first Dark Souls worked, the game that made the studio iconic. In recent years, the industry has simply lost its sense of proportion. We seem to have decided that good content must be diluted with dozens of hours of second-rate stuff because that's how it should be. We seem to have decided that good content must be diluted with dozens of hours of second-rate stuff because that's how it should be. So that the game has value, so that over 100 hours of gameplay sounds good in the trailer, although that's exactly what kills games. In this context, it's interesting to mention Call of Duty. The series has many problems, but the old Black Ops campaigns, the original Modern Warfare trilogy, and World at War were great precisely because there was nothing superfluous in them. Each mission was short, but it moved the game forward and was mostly unique. You went through the story in one breath. Yes, the campaigns were fast, but that's why they worked. The opposite example is Starfield, a game that promised hundreds of hours of content, but in order to make such a huge project, the quality had to be cut back in almost every system. Crafting and base building are worse than in Fallout 4. The dialogues are so awkward that they ruin the atmosphere. Stealth is so raw that missions built on it look damn boring. Starfield has combat zones that look exactly the same regardless of which planet you are on. The same corridors, the same chests, the same enemies. And even if the game has 5 to 20 hours of really cool quests, why not make a game that consists of just that? Why build hundreds of hours of, well, nothing just to justify the scale? And this leads to another problem. The industry is fixated on the amount of content simply because that's what players want. We ourselves have created a system where people judge a game by the number of hours it takes to complete rather than just by its quality. When someone says, "This game only lasted 5 hours, it's not worth the money," they are literally reinforcing the idea that length is more important than content. But length has never been an indicator of value. In this sense, Titanfall 2 is a perfect example of the opposite. The campaign is short and can be completed in one evening, but there are absolutely no moments in it that make you want to skip. We now live in a time when players want the impossible from developers. Huge worlds, dozens of mechanics, hundreds of hours of content, constant updates, and all this without compromising on quality. But it doesn't work that way. You can't expect a game to be both huge and perfect. Most studios simply don't have the resources to create something like Baldur's Gate 3, where almost every scene is handcrafted and every story has consequences. That's why compromises appear in the form of copy-paste, artificial delays, unnecessary systems, and in the future, possibly even AI. A game can be great and short at the same time. The short form often allows authors to reveal themselves better. That's why we love indie games that last 6 to 8 hours but give more emotions than long AAA games. There's no room for filler, only ideas realized to the maximum. It all boils down to a basic principle. If every other activity in the game feels like an obligation rather than an exciting moment, the pace is broken. Players can tolerate complexity, long dialogues, slow scenes, and even a lack of action, but they cannot tolerate boredom. As soon as the game starts to require effort without giving emotional return, the motivation disappears. Hence, the statistics where less than a third of players complete story masterpieces. All that remains for the player is to either endure constant repetitive grinding or accept that some games are just designed to be played like work, not experienced like stories. The point is that the average player feels the pace unconsciously. They don't put it into words, but they understand internally, "I'm bored." And at that moment, they simply close the game. Not because it's bad, not because it's difficult, but because it has lost its rhythm and stopped moving. Perhaps that's why Baldur's Gate 3 exploded the way it did. The pace is maintained not because the player is following the right route, it's maintained because the game reacts to your every choice as if it were part of a planned scenario. And another interesting example is the recent game Dispatch. It is currently in the sales charts in many countries, which I think was a surprise even for the developers. But the success of Dispatch, in which the episodes are only 40 minutes long by the way, I played through the first 4 episodes in just one evening and enjoyed doing so. So I think the success of this game proves that people are simply tired of endless worlds, hundreds of markers, and storylines that drag on for dozens of hours. As a result, we return to the most important idea. Time matters. It is the only resource that cannot be recovered. And if a game forces you to spend it without reward, it's not just bad, it's simply not worth your attention.